got to give me a shout out on Wednesday because I broke 3 things, so things you scramble on for hours.
Okay, it's going to go for another hour then. All right, call to order the May 24th meeting of the West Sacramento Public Financing Authority. We're going to start with the Pledge of Allegiance and ask Board Member McGowan to please lead us in the pledge. Right here.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
All right, our first item is item 1, presentations by the public on matters not on the agenda but within the jurisdiction of the authority. I can see by looking at the audience we have no members of the public present and no requests to speak. So that brings us to the consent agenda, which has 1 item.
I'll move consent.
It's been moved and seconded. Is there any question or discussion on the consent agenda? Seeing none, all those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Hearing none, that motion carries. Item 3 is consideration of a workshop on the Enhanced Infrastructure Financing District Infrastructure Financing Plan. Mr. Bloomberg.
Thank you. Today we want to focus on talking about the infrastructure financing plan. We'll have the PowerPoint coming up in a minute, but the City Council already had a workshop on this item a couple of weeks ago. Didn't have the benefit of having the draft plan in front of the council, but I'll try not to cover the same ground in the same way. Since you have the plan in front of you, I'll apologize in advance for the 375 pages we sent you. The body of the report's like 19 pages if you want to add the maps and a project list. The first 60 pages are what is critical. Those who want to get into the nitty-gritty can look at the appendices. But the one thing I'd say about the plan is it's supposed to be a long-term document. It's got a long life, literally decades. And so as a result, a lot of the detail has to go out, the analysis has to go out until as we got to 2065. So that said, I'll try to just focus in on some of the key points, and if we could go to the next slide, please. And so here we have the area. It's most of the old redevelopment area. It's about 4,100 acres approximate, roughly 25% of the city. Next slide, please. And as we look at it, at the life of the plan, we're looking at 45 years from the date that the bond issuance is authorized by the City Council. For the sake of our plan, that would be in 2019, 2020, and so most of the analysis you'll see goes out to 2065. Next slide, please. This is a real detailed slide. What's important to the authority here is that top amount, the 30.5%, is the amount of each new tax dollar generated from new development that will go to the EIFD. There are other amounts as we go. If I break this down for you, we're still going to have pass-throughs going to the city's general fund. We will have money that is, near the bottom there. You see the Measure G breakdown. I think we used $3.5 million at the time when the slide was prepared. That's going to go up over time, not by much, but it will increase. The layer at the bottom, the 2 layers are pre-1987 base. That's actually a very small number. But this is going to be how things look going out to 2036, 37, when the redevelopment area is completely dissolved. That's the original life of the plan. Next slide, please. This is what it looks like, let's say 2036, 37 going out to tentatively 2064, 65. Well, EIFD will get about 48% of the tax increment over a base year of 2016, 2017. Next slide, please. And so what does that mean in terms of revenue? If we go out 5 years, we project that EIFD will be getting about $6.3 million. That will go up to, going out 15 years to about $20 million. What we look at being a cumulative number over the life of the plan, about $1.2 billion, and that's in 2017 dollars. And then just the other columns there just show you the cumulative amounts. We bracketed it just again to show that there is the ability to budget less than 100% of the EIFD revenues to the EIFD, and we just wanted to show what if less than the total amount was committed over time. Next slide, please. Of course, we're at step 4 now. We've got the infrastructure financing plan published, and we're heading towards a public hearing before this body on June 28th. Next slide. And so the components of the plan, the ones that I'd really call out that are really important is projection of the revenues, and that is a lot of the appendices is how we have estimated the amount of revenues, what it's going to be spent on. There's a project list of $1.5 billion in projects, and then there's the fiscal impact analysis, and I have a couple slides on that. Next slide, please. So one of the concerns and one of the things we have to look at too is evaluating how much of the EIFD revenues could be committed to the district without having a negative impact on the city's general fund. So within your appendices, there is the fiscal impact analysis, but it, for the purposes of what we looked at, it was 100% of the EIFD revenues being dedicated, and what would happen in terms of taking that money away from the general fund to pay for city services. Next slide, please. And so in your analysis, you'll see we looked at a couple of the key funds that comprise the general fund, and we did a methodology where we looked at the generation of both residents and employees over time, and the cost that's applied to each one of those individuals. And then we looked at the amount of revenues that would be coming in if you took away the property tax amount. Next slide, please. And so there are revenues that we show dedicated, obviously, the property tax increment. You may commit in lieu motor vehicle license fees. That's not something we're looking at being the case. But for purposes of analysis, we tentatively looked at Measure G funds that potentially be committed. And the chief reason would be why if right away, if the council wanted to bond Measure G funds, they could, like right after the district is formed, and you'd already have that built-in flow. Next slide, please. And so we're obviously in the report, it's clear that we're not committing any sales or use taxes, TOT, or any property tax other than Measure G, and obviously no other city revenues going into it. Next slide. So I'll just a couple slides on policy considerations. So we do have a budget policy, and just so the two members who weren't at the council workshop, what is going to happen is the city council will budget EIFD revenues in the biennial budget or in the off-year update, and that will then be forwarded to the PFA, and the PFA under the statutes has to actually appropriate the money to the city council for that purpose. So that will be how things are budgeted. At the city, there will be a special revenue fund the funds flow into, and then it will be allocated out to different projects as per the annual budget that the PFA will be approving. There'll be definitions of community-wide benefit. We're relying on the general plan update, the recent general plan update, any community plans or master plans the council approves to kind of define what that is. There's a cap on the amount of EIFD revenue collected that's identified in the plan. And then we have a project list that shows that we have the ability to spend the money collected over that time. And pretty much we used everything that's within the CIP and within the general plan update in terms of projects that are identified as mitigations to growth. Next slide, please. We have a date, right now we think it will be 2065, but there's a drop dead date of 2116, should there never be an authorization to issue debt. And there are certain actions that we don't contemplate within the plan that are identified in your report. And then, most importantly, we assume that we're going to go to the voters to get approval. So this would be registered voters within the district, and we've got to get a 55% threshold. My understanding is that isn't what actually starts the clock on the term of the EIFD. It's the first authorization to issue debt, but we would likely go get the vote after the district's formed. Next slide, please. So quite simply, we've got the council being asked to approve the plan on the 14th, and then we'll come right back, and then the PFA will actually approve the formation in addition to approving the plan. So that concludes the presentation, if you have any questions.
Sandine?
Thank you, Mr. Baldwin. I actually have a question that's a little probably inconsequential, but I just kept fixating on it, so I'd like it to get answered, and it's on page 8 in the Kaiser Marston Associates report, and it's just listing the facilities that are going to be provided without assistance, and I think for me, it's just the way the sentence is written, so I just need some clarity. It says there are 4 public improvements in the area of EIFD number 1 that will be funded by government entities without financial assistance from EIFD number 1. They include the following. One of them is a State Streets Road reconstruction, but it's not actually in the it's not in the EIFD. The state streets aren't part of that. So that was just, for some reason, I just need that to be put to bed for me. And maybe it's just the phrase in the area of the EIFD, because it's a community-wide benefit. I get that piece, but it was just sticking, it was just catching me.
I don't have a good answer except to say that there's a certain randomness in terms of which projects got EIFD revenues, because it's purely illustrative.
Right.
But the one thing you made a point in terms of state streets not being within the EIFD. We can spend EIFD revenues there.
Community-wide.
So one thing that we need certain findings at the time that we had the PFA approve the budget, and it would be finding a community-wide benefit, and then there would have to be something about connectivity to the district. And since most of the projects are clustered around the EIFD, each sub-area, we don't think that either of those would be a problem. Nobody's tested what community-wide benefit means. There's no legal definition of it. So I'm sure we'll be pushing the envelope on that one.
I think it's pretty exciting that we're stepping out and trying to define this and to come up with, definitions and kind of guiding ourselves in a way to start this. So that I actually think we're making good progress. This all makes sense to me. That was just a minor and probably somewhat inconsequential thing, but it just, for some reason, how you read documents, you just can't get past this one. For me, I was just stuck there. So just thought I'd share, and if we can somehow smooth that over, that would be great. Thank you.
I have a quick question. Can you elaborate on page 2, number 3? It states the maximum number of dollars of tax revenue that may be allocated to EIFD number 1 shall not exceed $6.9 billion. What's the basis? How did you come up with that number?
Yeah, and for one thing, that's a future dollar number, and you'll see either 2017 dollars or future dollars. And then the way that number was created was it looked at all the potential revenue that could be pledged to the EIFD, so it included VLF funds, in addition to the future dollar amount of tax increment and Measure G funds.
Thank you.
So in several of the provisions in the plan use language like we don't anticipate any housing units will be removed, and we don't contemplate reimbursing a developer for a project that's not infrastructure costs and so on and so forth. What does that actually mean then in terms of the plan? If we've stated that, are we binding ourselves in some way, or would we have to do a new plan if we changed our minds?
Well, let's take the replacement housing provision first. Typically, and this was true under redevelopment where they had similar covenants, if you knew that, let's say a project we're going to take out housing units, at the time that you adopted the plan, you'd identify that, and you might have a more specific plan for how they would be replaced. You'd have a rough outline of your replacement housing identified in the plan. Since we don't have that, and we can't anticipate how a given project that the EIFD might fund might result in the loss of housing, all we're saying is that we will follow the statutes at that time, and that includes long-term. If it's ownership, there are certain covenants. If it's rental, there are certain covenants, and we would just follow the statutes, is what that means.
And the other provision on developer assistance?
I'm gonna, Constantine, do you want to take a shot at that? Yeah, I'm gonna, this is a legal one that kind of got me too, so I'm gonna.
Good evening, all. Well, I think the clause you're referring to is in section 8.
Correct, yeah.
So it says, while the city does intend to use revenues to reimburse developers for the cost of certain facilities, for the transit-oriented, they don't contemplate that that's going to be reimbursed. But for other items, there's the possibility that it would be reimbursed. But
Yeah, Aaron's got this one.
Yeah, that's fine.
certainly, yeah.
Yeah, I just want to distinguish that the Transit Priority Project Program is what that refers to. We don't anticipate using that program, but that section, we made clear so it would say, we do contemplate the possibility of reimbursing for improvements for private development projects. What the statute requires is you to state, if you're planning to use the Transit Priority Project Program, which is a separate section of state code, you have to address it in this section. We don't plan to use that program, but we do contemplate reimbursing developers for infrastructure costs as an option, at least.
Yeah,
So
I mean, on the policy, even a broader reading of this, I'm supportive of. I think we have, not with 100% fidelity, but we have, I think, over time, moved more and more, increasingly to a position of we don't subsidize projects. We try to make areas more possible for projects to succeed, but we're not picking the winners. Which is not the case from 15 years ago. We would, give this project $500,000, this one asked for $3 million, and then it wouldn't get built, or it would get built and it wouldn't cause anything else. And instead we said, no, we'll fund the infrastructure improvements or the park or the sewer line or whatever, and that will reduce your cost as a project, but it will also reduce the cost of other projects, and we're not deciding which project's going to get all the money. That has, and so we've had that as an operating philosophy at the city for a while. I think it's been very, very effective. It also makes it easier when we say to voters, we are using property tax revenues for this purpose, and we're not using it for the same reasons that redevelopment was taken away. Essentially, that these deals that we're giving, where we're giving that tax dollars over to a fully private project. So I liked it. It just wasn't clear, since we said we're not contemplating it, what does that mean we can't, or?
We haven't tied the hands of future city councils by having any of the, actions that are authorized under the statute be, prohibited under the plan.
Yeah, but if we ultimately need to get a 55% vote, and so in a technical sense, get support for what it is that we want to do, but also explain why it is that we are using property tax, our property tax revenue for up to the rest of our lives and our kids, it's for appropriate purposes, that unfettered future flexibility isn't necessarily ideal in terms of being able to appropriately justify to the people that we serve that that this is the right choice. So that policy provision, I think, is a good one, frankly, and we ought to be providing at least heavy guidance to our successors, if not binding them in some way around the use of that, so that it's easier to explain to constituents. Yeah, we could have spent that same dollar somewhere else in the city, but instead we're putting in this because this is what's generating. This is the goose that lays the golden egg. But we're not paying somebody else. We're not paying a private developer just to improve to make marketable, to make a project profitable for them. Which is what didn't get us in trouble. We got lots of Southern Californians in trouble with respect to redevelopment. So,
Yeah, question. I think I agree, I think I agree with your analysis and your conclusion, but the question I have is, it kind of goes back to maybe I'm not clear of the process, but ultimately then, are you going to be asking this plan to be blessed by the voters?
The voters don't approve the plan or bless the plan in any way. They just authorize the issuance of debt.
Okay.
That's what goes to the voters.
Okay. And in that ask of the community then to issue the debt, you're going to want to make sure I assume we're going to be explaining to them, what the deal is. And if the deal is we're not going to tie the hands of future councils, because it's not our intention, it's not our policy, it's not our culture, and I totally agree with all of that. But in the future, a later council could do something differently. And I'm even okay with that. But I think as we go forward, however we message that, I think it's part of it, because we're asking the community. If we ask them to essentially weigh in or buy into this plan, whether I don't think it's as subtle as narrow as that they're just going to issue the authorization for the issuance of the bonds. That may be all they're really doing technically, but I think it is sort of it is a buy-in, and we want it because we want to be able to point to that. Just as Measure G ultimately was gave the council the ability to say, we're going to restrict these funds from other purposes that we could spend them on, and they got the approval of the county, or the city to do that, the voters to do that. So it's just more of a ramble than it is really a question, I guess. But when we get to that point, I would hope it's clear to the voters what not just what their immediate action is on the vote, but what's really at stake here in a broader sense. And they're basically, I would think we'd want them to bless an economic development incentive plan and understand it, that's all.
Could I suggest, there are 2 points in the future where policies could be put in that further refine the use of EIFD funds. One may be when we go to the voters to get authorization to issue the bonds, there can be additional policies put in place at that time. And then, of course, with each bond issue, the list of projects that the funds could be used on could also be further defined.
Well, I don't necessarily think it has to be codified someplace or mandatory, but it may be very well enough that it become truly part of our practice and culture as opposed to part of the law. Because this one of the reputations that this city has earned is that it has a clear direction. It tells people what they're going to do, and then it goes about doing what they say they're going to do. So there's a high level of confidence and credibility with the council and the actions that the community takes. I'm just pointing out that as you go forward, to keep that in mind so we don't inadvertently lose some of that trust and credibility that we've developed through the years.
And I would agree with you, Mr. McGowan, on the premise of that. And I think we had a little bit of discussion when this was at City Council originally. And I think we do want to push forward as we move forward. We have to think about that council in 2036 and whatever else. And Cabalden may still be here. I'm not sure about the rest of us, but
You should be mayor.
he could be, yeah. But I think it is important that we somehow make sure that I think one of the discussions we had back at that on the discussion around this was
around the flexibility that's kind of built into the program and the plan, I should say. And while that's nice to have, I think we also want to articulate some of that we want this, there was a very specific purposes that were in place for this. And so, the Mayor, your comments around item 8 were around how we want to leverage this, not for actually investment into subsidizing a specific project for a developer, but the infrastructure work and all these sorts of things Mr. McGowan brought. We have to find a way to communicate that as part of the going forward, because that's the principle that we've started on through Measure G and through the formation of this district, and it's something we have to continually remind ourselves of. So I don't know how we do that, but it will be important, I think, to make sure everybody's reminded that these monies, when they go for a vote 10 years from now on bonding for this, that we're reminding ourselves what we're doing this for. And not that, hopefully some of us are still on council, some of us are on this district, can remind ourselves why we're here. I just want to make sure that's an important principle. And I did look at the EIFD goals and objectives. It does have in there leverage private investment. It has some of the things in there about how we leverage outside funds. That's important too, but it maybe need to be stronger than that.
Even Measure G itself was, the whole purpose of Measure G was to write a letter to the future.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, if our prime directive was maximize flexibility of future councils, we wouldn't have done Measure G. We wouldn't be doing an EIFD. So, and so we have this mechanism set up because we and the public knew the animal instincts that take over in any particular budget cycle is, let's not invest in the long term and let's spend the money on our current needs. That's just, we all do that in our daily lives, and government can do the same thing. And so Measure G was saying, let's not do, redevelopment gave us a tool and forced us to save, and so we want to keep doing that. That will reduce the relative amount of flexibility that future councils have, but that discipline is necessary. And I think the exact same thing is true with respect to these private project subsidies. In the moment when they are there and a private developer says, I have this beautiful 4-story office building that I want to put in Stone Lock or whatever, and I could just make it happen if you just had $500,000. And it's just as a bad use of those funds. In fact, it's worse than if we had diverted it in the budget process for any of the other number of uses that Measure G and the AIFD were intended to constrain us. And they don't fully bind us, right? We don't have to allocate any money to the EIFD, but we've set all the knobs and the buttons in order to make that the default. That our increment is going to go into the EIFD, even though in the future it could change. And I think, the extent to which we can do that on this question is important, both for itself, but also thinking ahead to a bond campaign. Frankly, I don't want to be defending a charge that, oh, well, look, this money could be used to pay for the Raiders, whatever. I mean, maybe the Raiders is a bad example, but the sorts of things that redevelopment took the hit for, even though we're not contemplating ever doing it, but, it would be nice to have the 1% chance that we might someday in 2022. That may not be worth having a campaign about the measure that turns into a completely turns on the question of should taxpayer money be going to, to these private boondoggle projects. And so it is a strategic question as, how much of is that flexibility worth for future councils as well. So I don't know what the answer is, and maybe there are other forms in which to deal with that question, but I do think it's an important one as we move forward.
And I don't want to dwell on this either, Mr. Mayor, but Measure G to me is a good example. It was very clear, it was made very clear, it was very clear to the voter what they were doing. They were going to carve out money. They didn't have to, and they were going to do it, and they obviously very overwhelmingly said, yes, that's a good thing to do. And then they trusted you to do the right thing. I'm not suggesting you do anything differently than you're doing, but I am an admirer of that action of Measure G and the way it was conveyed to the community. And I think they understood it, and I think, again, that's what helps build the covenant between the community and the leadership of the community to be able to do these things. Mm-hmm. So however you do that, I mean, I don't have to worry about that anymore, but as long as we're clear.
Yes, you do.
I think I guess this community
You're now on a
is.
board that deals with $6.9 billion worth of money.
This community is intelligent enough if you tell them, here's what we want to do, and we're going to do, or not going to do, or we want the flexibility, we don't want the flexibility. They're certainly capable of understanding that, and then if they bless whatever it is you put on the table, then that's the deal. Mm-hmm. So that's my rant.
So if I could comment on this is a good place to have this discussion. That's why we're doing this workshop. Absolutely, on your first comment about why we did Measure G, why we're doing the EIFD, is because we want to make sure while we have the flexibility, we want to make sure that we're signaling to the future that this is for what we intended to do when we started, after redevelopment. On the point about private development and subsidizing, for lack of a better term, private development projects, believe it or not, the city still does have a development assistance policy. It's extremely flawed, if you ask me, and I think that's a good place to maybe revisit this issue. When we set up the EIFD and also the way we've used Measure G in some instances, I think there are good examples of what could be considered a subsidy to a project, and there are really bad examples that you could point back to redevelopment. But we have had instances where, in terms of things like structured parking or oversized infrastructure, where a developer, especially in an infill area, as you know, where it's very challenged to not only take care of your own infrastructure, but you might have to improve an entire block just to do your one project. There are plenty of examples that we can cite that it would make sense to apply this tool as a reimbursement measure or as a way to leverage the CFD. But I do think we need some definition. This is out there. We're already getting inquiries from developers about, hey, I heard you have this new tax increment tool. What does it mean to me? So I think it is probably worth our time as a next step after we put this into place, is to revisit that policy and come up with some guidelines for that and go through the city council and back to the PFA board to start to memorialize the intentions there, so it's not seen as an open-ended developer assistance tool. It's more a strategic tool for the city to use when it makes sense to leverage additional private investment. So we could return on that later.
All right, that makes sense. It makes sense. I do think the test is more than does it make sense to do the private incentive. This is a special case because and these are dollars that you need to be. It needs to be a strong enough reason to do this thing. It's not just that it would be nice to give this project a thing and it will help get it across the line or whatever. It needs to be good enough that you can walk over to the community center and tell the folks there that the fact that they won't get any additional money out of property tax increment is because of that subsidy, right? That this is money that we are diverting institutionally for decades. And so it's not just an economic, it's not like, is it a good economic development thing or not? No, is it so important to leverage, to be the goose and to be producing golden eggs or not? And that's a test that because you would insist on the same thing if we were taking economic development money and diverting it and giving it to parks. You'd want to go, okay, fine, I'm okay with that. Maybe you wouldn't, but I'm okay with that, but it better be really outstanding and not just it's a good thing. And so as you're thinking this through, the examples you gave sounded mostly like oversized infrastructure and things that we affirmatively do want to support. Right. Not a direct project subsidy because I have a project that just that my pro forma is $1 million short and I need help.
And I only raise that
and it's not that the city can't do that, but if the city wants to do that, the city needs to come up with some other funding source than diverting property taxes in a systemic way from all the police, fire, parks, and every other services that we do.
Yeah, we really just want to be clear as staff that those are the sorts of arrangements that are open versus a blanket policy where, it could be very narrowly construed that we will only do public infrastructure projects that don't have any tie to any private development.
Sure.
That we would not recommend that, but having a clear focus on return on investment, and that can mean a lot of different things. But we can work on a policy using the one that we already have and come back to council and the board with that after we form the district.
Okay.
So.
All right, that makes sense. The other question I had was on the fiscal impact analysis, which I tried reading at least a couple dozen of the 5,000 tables in the back, and I couldn't find the table that brought it all together and said, here is the per capita cost that we're anticipating over this period of time, and here's the per capita non-increment revenues. And I'm sure it's there somewhere, but I could not find that. There are a lot of things about, this kind of housing produces this kind of cost in the community, in the city manager's contingency fund of 50 cents. So a lot of that, but I could never find it where it all rolled up and said, okay, the retail and the sales tax and other revenues will cover this proportion or all of the cost or the increased cost of additional development.
I think the closest we get to that would be on page 258.
Of course, I should have kept reading. I stopped at 243.
And it's Exhibit 1, and it has the general fund impacts new development within EIFD 1.
Okay, so just since I'm looking at this de novo, is what this is saying is that even with, with 100% allocation of the increment, that we would fully cover the cost with a modest surplus of the new development itself over time?
In a given build-out year of 2043, 44, there are other tables where they actually have it year by year. Yeah, this just summarizes it. So it would be in the follow-up tables here.
Okay. All right.
Table 1 is where it is annually estimated, and you could follow it out year by year.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, this will be a key issue over time, and I think, we don't have the answers on how to structure it ultimately, what the right allocation of increment is to the EIFD. At least for right now, I support the 100%. We're at small dollars at the moment as well, and and it's not yet generating the costs either. But more than the 50% or the 25% proportion of that the report analyzed, I don't think those are satisfactory as policy approaches, and maybe more nuanced things about over time, there's some share that happens, or there's some minimum dollar figure, or there's some minimum per capita figure. So I think we'll have the chance to do it, but I do think it's worth developing some systems and options around how we might deal with increasing not just increases in the base cost, but just focuses on is that as we do this kind of development, we have residents with higher levels of demands, things that didn't exist, technologies and other things that didn't exist before that we're going to have to invest in. Things will change. I mean, and so thinking about how some amount or some proportion of the increment makes its way into the general fund over time, without it being, because I'm really worried about we'll just decide annually, because we will. Other than bonding, right? We'll set our bond rates, so we'll be legally obligated to that. But other than that, we will decide annually that's asking for a whole lot of trouble. In a whole lot of different ways, and so figuring out what the right approach is that will make sense if you're in the Parks Department or Community Development or Fire or whatever, and say, okay, that's right, because we're doing this in order to maximize the amount of tax revenue we're doing it for a lot of reasons, but one of them is to maximize the tax revenue that can support all of the essential functions and services of the city. We want to make sure we get that right. So this is good. The 100%, I think the council said, please do that, as opposed to come in at 90% or 80%, just, a priori. But I think it's worth continuing to put our best thinking on how to look at that over the long future.
And Mayor, I just wanted to, there was a comment you made at the council workshop that I thought about, and in looking at the plan, when they bond, they're actually looking at 150% coverage. So in any given year, at least with bond issues, you're going to have a certain amount that they're assuming for coverage that would be available for PAYGO expenses. And so one thing they talk about in the plan is that you may have a certain amount of bonding that goes on, and I think it's about $535 million worth of bonding, and it's almost an equal amount, or $500 million, that goes in a PAYGO annualized basis towards funding projects as well. So I just wanted to point that out, that's in the plan.
Okay, great, thanks. All right. Other questions or comments? All right, so this was a workshop only, no action required. Thank you very much. So let's proceed to 4A, which is a report of the executive director.
Just that we will come back, as we talked about in one of the slides, we'll come back to approve the plan on June 28th, and compliments to the staff and moving forward on this and establishing 2017 as the base year. I mean, it's a major achievement, so we'll be back on the 28th.
Great, terrific. All right, do we have a report on PFA actions? And we have no future agenda item requests. So is there a motion to adjourn?
I move to get out of here.
I'll second.
Okay, it's been moved and seconded. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Hearing none, motion carries. Meeting is adjourned. Thank you.